I've said it before and I'll say it again. Headlines are very often the only part of a news piece that gets read. That's why I focus on them. People are short on time, articles can be paywalled, a social media snapshot of a headline is easier to consume than 800 words of detail. So it's important to get headlines right. And in the nearly 2 years of this genocide in Gaza, there have been so many headlines that have been so wrong. And then Israel started its war with Iran.
Moments ago, Israel launched Operation Rising Lion, a targeted military operation to roll back the Iranian threat to Israel's very survival.
Netanyahu had already set the tone for how the story would get reported. And then the floodgates opened on the typical headlines we see whenever Iran is involved. There was an additional element this time because Israel was deeply involved as well. The language used by news outlets has been so revealing. Israel's strikes were characterized exactly as Israel described it. They were called preemptive. Anything by Iran was an escalation rather than a retaliation. When Israel would issue a statement, it was a warning, almost as if it was a public service announcement. But if Iran said something, it was a threat. Then there's the Israeli government versus the Iranian regime. Even though Netanyahu has spent 17 years in office and has shredded due process in Israel. Of course, there are big problems with the Iranian state. Headlines and news reporting should reflect that by all means. But don't whitewash what's been happening in a state that is already carrying out a genocide and then started a whole new war.
Well, thank God for Bibi Netanyahu. He has cut through the fog and done, frankly, what should have been done as long as 20 years ago.
Fundamentally, we have an issue with terminology and framing. When you look at the headlines, the overwhelming impression is that Israel is almost always justified in its actions, or at the very least, that we can have a reasonable debate about how justified it is. The US was always part of Israel's war because the US funds and arms Israel. But there was this drumbeat for Trump to actually use some of the most powerful weapons on Earth to bomb Iran's nuclear facilities.
There is only one bomb that can destroy Fordo. There is only one plane that can carry that bomb, and those are American weapons and planes.
In a New York Times piece, not even an op-ed, this was the headline. Trump's Iran choice, last chance diplomacy or a bunker-busting bomb. Really? Who decided those are his choices? The New York Times used to be called the paper of record, and they're basically saying the president of the United States either has a chance at diplomacy, and by the way, Iran was engaged in talks until Israel attacked it, or if negotiation isn't possible, then the US can just bomb Iran with 30,000-pound bombs. Even presenting the choice like this implies that the two options are as legitimate as each other, but that's not the case. The decision to bomb another country is not the same as talking to them. Then you have other news pieces as well, on TV and online. There are all these complex graphics showing you bomber jets, showing you bombs, and then 3D mock-ups of Iranian nuclear facilities. And what goes unsaid in all of this is that there needs to be a democratic process here. You need congressional approval. We need to determine, does Iran even really pose an imminent threat? Would this be permissible under international law? But none of this is even part of the discussion.
Tonight, I can report to the world that the strikes were a spectacular military success. Iran's key nuclear enrichment facilities have been completely and totally obliterated. Iran, the bully of the Middle East, must now make peace. If they do not, future attacks will be far greater and a lot easier.
So after Trump's big bomb and the big announcement, the op-eds started getting churned out. And it's bad enough for news outlets to normalize the use of these massive weapons on a sovereign nation, despite the lack of clear justification. But what we saw was actually worse. There were these congratulatory pieces. Honestly, I don't know how much courage it takes to drop 30,000-pound bombs on another country when you have no one that you're accountable to. There was no process of challenge or discussion by the elected representatives of government. It was simply Trump's call to make. This editorial by the Wall Street Journal, the headline implies a kind of heroism, but then there's also the sentence under the headline that really caught my attention. Iran is characterized as an intolerable risk. This is the typical Orientalist trope used for Iran. It is presented on the one hand as a weak and feckless regime where everyone in the country is hoping to be bombed in order to be liberated. But on the other hand, it's an intolerable risk and it's all-powerful. It's called the head of the snake, and its nuclear program, which has been under IAEA oversight, is seen as a threat, whereas Israel's possession of actual nuclear weapons, which are not subject to any international regulation, that's barely even mentioned. You always hear Iran being called a destabilizing force in the region or in the world. But Israel, which has bombed 4 countries this year alone while terrorizing the Palestinian-occupied territories, is never called a destabilizing force. The coverage of the Gaza genocide has already been bad. And to add to that, after so many months of killing being live streamed to our phones, there's a fatigue. What happened during the 12 days of Israel's war on Iran was that even less attention was given to Gaza. And people may say that, news outlets can only cover so many big stories at a time, but the Iran war was not entirely separate from the Gaza genocide. The culprit that connects them is Israel. Israel is always painted as acting purely in self-defense, even when it's on the attack. Palestinians are being killed by the dozens every single day. Every single day, while trying to get aid. You do see some coverage of this atrocity in the media, but just try comparing that with the sort of reporting we saw of Israelis who were injured or killed in Iran's retaliatory strikes.
You're looking live at Tel Aviv, Israel, where at least 8 people were killed and dozens were injured in an early morning missile attack from Iran.
Those victims get tons of headlines, and I don't begrudge that. Victims of war should make the news. But the media attention is just not proportional. It's not proportional to the number of Iranian civilians that were killed. It's not proportional to the number of Palestinians that have been killed, or the manner in which they've been killed by Israel. My headline correction started as a way of setting the record straight, adding in a word, putting an attribution, or cutting out stuff that's inaccurate. The reactions, especially from journalists, has actually been quite positive. And I think that speaks to the fact that so often it's the institutions that create these limitations, not individual journalists. Of course, there might be some problematic journalists, but most of the time there are power structures and editorial red lines imposed on how stories are reported. So that's what we're seeing reflected in these headlines. It's an institutional bias, an establishment perspective, and the victor's version of history as it happens. I'm not the only person correcting this stuff, but it's an indication of how many people want their media to get it right that people refer headlines to me to look at, or increasingly they call out the headline writers and say, we can't have this be the record of this moment. You need to correct this.
Thank you for watching. Hit that like button and leave us a comment to let us know what you thought about anything we covered this week. And don't forget to follow us on social media. The links are in the description, and you can also subscribe to our newsletter for updates from the show.